there! I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and I'm back from vacation. I need to finish up on doing the second half of my travel vlog and reading wrap-up from the time that I was in Cambodia. But in the meantime, I've been catching up on other people's videos that I missed out on while I was away, and one of the things that I've been really watching a lot of are people's stats videos. I don't normally get too in-depth on my own stats, but I thought it might be fun to do, and I had some extra free time, so I thought I'll go through the list on Goodreads and see what's there. It's not a perfect representation of everything that I read because there are a lot of rereads that I didn't track, especially when I was going through the Great Unhaul, as I called it, when I was thinning out books before I moved. But of the books that I did track on Goodreads, there were 160 of them, which constituted 39,642 pages. Let's look at some actual statistics. So, in terms of fiction versus nonfiction, I think last year it was about 2/3 fiction to 1/3 nonfiction. It's more or less the same, it's pretty close. Fiction was about 60% of what I read this year, nonfiction just under 40%, and about 3% were other. And by other, either poetry collections that are primarily memoir-esque, but that aren't necessarily specifically clarified by the author as being one or the other, and also a few things that were collections of both essays and short stories, both fiction and nonfiction within a single title. I think that's probably what my standard is most years, unless I'm completely into— I was gonna say unless I get really into a particular topic that I want to research, but I think in 2017 I had a run like that and it still came out to a similar percentage, so that's probably my standard. In terms of format of the book itself, I read just over 50% of my reading was ebooks, almost entirely of which I think are probably through Overdrive. Physical books were about 40%, and audiobooks were just under 10%. I haven't listened to any audiobooks in quite a while. I usually only listen to them when I'm walking the dog, and I'm in an area with terrible weather right now, so I just haven't been doing that. I don't have the attention span to listen to audiobooks in very many situations, so I know for some people that's a huge component of their reading, quote unquote, but yeah, I just can't do it. I'd like to be able to listen to audiobooks while I'm doing chores or working or something, but I just can't pay attention to them that way. Did I say that most of those ebooks were probably through Overdrive? Because my next stat is going to be the source of the books. Over 80% of the books that I read this past year were from the library. Yeah, so the vast majority of books that I read this year were from the library. It was 81.4%. Just under 18% were books that I owned, and less than 0.5% were books that I had borrowed from an individual. I think that was probably the one book that my friend lent me. So that's interesting. I don't normally track author demographics just because I don't think it's necessarily useful unless you're reading within a really narrow framework of bigger demographics. But since everybody does this, I thought I would do it too. In terms of gender, I read 43% of the books that I read were by male authors, 42% were by female authors, and 15% were by multiple authors, so they were either essay collections, short story collections, poetry collections, or comics or graphic novels that had multiple authors of more than one gender. A very close split, so I guess that's good. I know some people try to read more of one or the other, but I'm not particularly invested in that. The other demographic that a lot of people do is in terms of ethnicity, and that especially I don't think is super useful unless you're reading within a single country, but for the sake of argument, about 36.1% of the books that I read were written by white authors, 39.2% were people who would be classified as people of color within an American context, about 10% were written by multiple authors with multiple backgrounds, and 14.4% were a category that I called It's Complicated. Within a global context, I don't think it's necessarily useful to classify people this way. So this category included people who would be considered white in the countries in which they live, but wouldn't be in an American context, which includes a lot of North African, Middle Eastern, and Latin American authors. It also includes anybody from the countries that are simultaneously in both Europe and West Asia. So anybody who is Azerbaijani, Turkish, Armenian. I didn't read any Azerbaijani authors this year. I do listen to Azerbaijani music though, so maybe I should read more. But anyway, I think that's a useful statistic if you're reading primarily authors from the United States or the United Kingdom. I don't know how useful it is globally because I think if your goal is to read widely, it's probably more useful to look at it geographically, and I think if your goal is to support marginalized authors, then I think that doesn't necessarily work because you end up classifying people who are, for example, Japanese from Japan, which is not a marginalized ethnic group, versus, for example, I read a book that was by a Kosovar refugee in Finland, and that's a white person, but it is about a marginalized experience. So if that was your goal, those two things aren't really measured in that statistic. Again, I think for people who are reading primarily within a US or a UK or a Canadian context exclusively, I do think that makes sense to track. And I did think it was interesting to look at. So within that, I did break it down further because I think that is maybe more useful. I do kind of disproportionately read authors of Western European backgrounds. That was, I think, just over a quarter, and then similar percentages from South Asia, West Asia, and East Asia. I didn't read any authors who would be Northeastern Europe or Southeastern Asia last year, so it did make me think, well, I should go read some Vietnamese or Polish authors, because I certainly have in the past, but that was obviously something I didn't read last year. Oh, I did notice that in terms of First Nations authors, they were entirely Canadian, so I hadn't read any American or Latin American Indigenous authors, so that was maybe interesting to consider. And again, even in doing this breakdown, I felt like the breakdown between West Asia and Southeastern Europe is not a particularly clear border, so I'm not super happy with the way I broke this down, even having broken it down this way. But let's go into forms contained within the books. And even 50%, or half of what I read, was long-form prose style writing. 28.2% were comics or sequential art, slightly more than 10% were essays, 3.5% were plays, about 2.5% each were short stories and poetry, a similar percentage were novellas, and less than 1% were picture books. I didn't include a category for mixed media books, although I know I read at least one, so I think I must have included that in the comics category instead. That's not bad. I'd had an idea that I would read a little bit more poetry and a little bit more theater writing this year, which clearly I didn't because I think those were between 2 and 3% last year as well. But I'm overall pretty satisfied with that. I think the one thing that I'm not satisfied with is the language in which I was reading the books. I think I said last year that I would like to maybe keep my works that I read in English at around 90%, and I think it was around 97%. I read one graphic memoir in German and one collection of poetry in Afrikaans, and I read about 5 graphic novels that were in French, and I think everything else that I read this year was in English. So that wasn't super successful, so that's something I might want to work on again this year. But again, at least it wasn't 100% English, so it could be worse. I didn't do a tracking of original language or books in translation in general, so that might have been interesting. So that would be something I might track some other time, because that might be interesting to look at. I feel like I have more fun watching other people talk about their statistics than I did listing off that. Anyway, since I'm watching other people's, I feel like I should engage in the trade-off of sharing my own information. Anyway, those were my stats for the year. If I missed any really obvious statistics, let me know which ones you track that I didn't that might be interesting. Did you get any numbers that surprised you? Do you feel like you have a good grasp on what type of books you're reading and what you didn't? It occurs to me that the thing I didn't track that a lot of people do is genre, so some other time. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.